Here we are, another perfect day. That's if you don't think about what's happening around the world, the climate emergency, the Gaza issues. But what I want to talk about today is the National Day of Shame, 14th of October 2023. Now, the colonisation process began in 1788, which is 235 years ago. And obviously the colonisation process had profound implications for this country's First Nations people. Aboriginals who'd lived on the continent and many of the islands surrounding the continent for over 65,000 years, and Torres Strait Islanders who'd lived in the area between Cape York and Papua New Guinea for about 15 to 18,000 years. Now, the 14th of October 2023, a few weeks ago, Australians were faced with a decision. Not the government of the day, but the people of this country. Every citizen who had the right to vote, every citizen over the age of 18 who is registered on the electoral roll. And the decision was very simple. It was a yes or no answer. Now, under the Australian Constitution, the constitutional arrangements cannot be changed without a majority of electors and a majority of states, and there are only 6 states in this country, who are willing to take that step. And unfortunately or fortunately, whatever you like, however you like to think about it, I think about it as unfortunately, there has never been any process in our constitutional arrangements which, one, have recognised First Nations people, and 2, have actually been involved in a process to create a treaty, let alone truth-telling. And in 2017, the majority of delegates from around the country, from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders community, put out the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Now, obviously the Uluru Statement of the Heart had an overwhelming majority, not 100%, but an overwhelming majority of people who attended as delegates. They put out their hands to the Australian people despite their history, and asked for 3 things. The first thing was recognition in the Australian Constitution via a voice to Parliament. The voice to Parliament would be an advisory, non-binding organisation, which will be determined by Parliament. Why did they want more than just recognition, but recognition with a voice to Parliament? Because every time that an Indigenous organisation like the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission was set up, every time there was a change of government with a more conservative agenda, that particular organisation was abolished. The delegates at the Uluru Statement from the Heart in 2017 never again wanted their advisory groups to be abolished through a change of government. They did not want them to be abolished by a change of government. The second step was truth-telling and treaty, the second and third step. The Aboriginal community and Torres Strait Islander community put out their hands to the Australian people and said, now is the time to reconcile. So the Labor Party, which won the last federal election under the leadership of Mr Albanese, promised to hold a referendum to see if we could include a non-binding advisory committee as the recognition of Indigenous peoples' place in this society. Now, we had a particularly bruising campaign over the last 2 to 3 months. It was a fascinating campaign because we saw the ultra-radicals, the Black Sovereign movement, join hands with the white supremacist movement, the Squatters Party, the National Party and the Liberal Party. Now, this was not a coalition of their own making, but it was a discussion about too little versus too much. And the Black Nationalist movement, the Sovereign movement, believed that a voice to Parliament was too little. Not understanding that this was just a step towards treaty and truth telling. At the same time, we had forces in this country, conservative and reactionary forces, who were always concerned about ownership, treaty, compensation, who were able to manipulate through the media, through social media, were able to manipulate the Black Sovereign movement to suit their particular agenda. And their agenda is no treaty, no voice, no truth-telling. Because ultimately in a referendum, no is no, yes is yes. So on the 14th of October, after this bruising campaign, which was spearheaded by elements on social media which used misinformation, disinformation, the same thing we saw after the Mabo decision in 1992, but on steroids, attempt to convince people that voting no was the right thing to do. To deny First Nations people a voice, a non-binding advisory voice in the Constitution, was wrong, was dangerous. And people don't need much to reinforce their underlying prejudices. And that's what we saw on the 14th of October. And it's quite interesting that if you look at the way the nation voted, the only area which voted yes was the Australian Capital Territory, which is just a territory. Every other state voted no. I think Victoria had the closest result, 45% to 55%. And in the states further afield, with the largest Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population, we saw a resounding no vote to this very, very minor constitutional change. Now, there are ramifications, and these ramifications, which will last decades, will last generations, because no government, after the resounding no vote, is going to move towards a treaty of truth-telling. Now, we saw elements of the Black Sovereign movement claim that a rejection of the voice to Parliament would mean that governments would move on to treaty. Government will not move on to treaty. You cannot expect treaty negotiations from the National Party. You cannot expect treaty negotiations from the Liberal Party. You could possibly expect treaty negotiations from the Greens, but considering the overwhelming no vote, there will be no treaty negotiations as far as the ALP government is concerned about the next election and its ability to be re-elected. This was a step backwards. Not just a step backwards, but it was running backwards. The no vote occurred for a variety of reasons. Obviously, the Black Sovereign movement was not the major issue when Australians voted no. Most Australians have no idea what a black sovereign movement is. But what happened is the negative campaign, which was promoted by the black sovereign movement, which was then picked up by more conservative and reactionary elements in the black community, which was fanned by disinformation and misinformation on social media, and to a large degree the Murdoch media, and to a significant degree the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, who under its legislative agenda needed to give equal time to both sides of the argument. So why did people vote no? This was a minor constitutional change. Why couldn't people come to the decision to put a yes? Now it's interesting, if you look at Victoria and you look at the electorate of Nichols, which was named after Pastor Nichols, who was a very significant person in terms of Indigenous fighting, Pastor Doug Nichols, who eventually became Governor of Victoria, you will find that the no vote was almost 80%. The interesting bit is that one of the largest Aboriginal populations in Victoria lives around the Shepparton area, the Yorta Yorta people. And to see the electorates from this area vote overwhelmingly no had nothing to do with the Black Sovereign Movement campaign. The campaign in that particular part of Victoria was all about reinforcing negative stereotypes. Negative stereotype on negative stereotype. So obviously the Australian people made a decision. And that decision, to a large degree, was due to the lingering discrimination, stereotypes, misinformation, disinformation, which continues regarding a minuscule part of the Australian population, less than 4%. A minuscule part. In the more traditional areas, where Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders have a more cohesive culture, we saw votes for the voice up to 80%. I mean, these traditional societies understood the value of an advisory body. They understood how important an advisory body was. Unfortunately, among the Australian community, and let's not forget, 50% of Australians were actually born overseas or have a parent who was born overseas. Unfortunately, we didn't see the church groups campaign for a voice vote, because there are many religious or faith-based groups which believed that the voice was about dividing this country. And to a significant degree, the blame does not just lie on regional Australia and its continuing ambivalent relationship with First Nations people. But the blame also lies in the suburbs of the major capital cities, where most people have never seen or spoken to an Indigenous Australian or a First Nations person. And we saw these significant no votes in these areas. Maybe people don't understand, but obviously the question was very simple. There was nothing difficult about the question. But the propaganda regarding the question was significant. So what's the fallout? The fallout is extraordinary, because what it means is that the momentum which was building after the Uluru Statement from the Heart in 2017 has now been destroyed. There is no momentum for a voice. There is no momentum for a treaty. There is no momentum for truth-telling. Various governments, like the Victorian government and the South Australian government, which have embarked on that journey, now feel threatened because they know they don't have the support of the majority of the people in the states of South Australia and Victoria. And the federal government knows if there is no support for an innocuous change like a voice to Parliament, there is no support for a treaty, because treaties are about reconciling. They're about acknowledging the past. They are about compensating people for what has occurred. This is a dark day. The 14th of October is a dark day in this country's history. In my opinion, it's a date of shame. And in many regards, it's as significant as the 1788 colonisation, the beginning of colonisation in 1788 of the Australian continent. Just as significant. For us to continue to deny, after we became an independent country in 1901, recognition to this country's First Nations people, recognition to their ownership of this land, highlights a huge problem as far as attitudes are concerned, especially among older Australians who have been immersed in a sea of discrimination. Ultimately, whether change occurs or not, will not rely on people like me and older Australians. It most likely won't rely on most of the people who watch this clip, but it will rely on younger Australians. And there are two things that we can take as positive aspects of the voice referendum. One is we have a base of 40% from which to work from. Although most of this 40% is from the inner suburbs of the capital cities, there are people of goodwill across this country. Even in the most conservative, reactionary electorates, despite the National Party propaganda, despite the Liberal Party propaganda, despite disinformation, despite misinformation, we have seen significant sections of the Australian population vote yes. And more exciting is the fact that it was the younger generations who have beginning to understand through the education process the nature of this country, how this country developed, and the fact that we have never acknowledged the past as a community, who will be the people who will change what has occurred. The 14th of October was a missed opportunity. It was missed for a variety of reasons. It was missed because people who felt that the voice was too little couldn't bear to be involved in the campaign and actively campaign a no vote, not understanding the significant ramifications of such a vote. So think about it. It's not over. It's a continuing struggle. But that struggle has been made much, much, much harder through the loss of the voice referendum.